much. For me, it's a great pleasure. I'm a little bit confused now when you said about the cherries, so that means that people are following me everywhere. I was last week in Georgia, fantastic place, and it's the cherry season, which is fantastic. And yes, I published something on the cherries. Georgia and Bulgaria have equally wonderful cherries, so if you have time, do buy some cherries and have them. So I will tell you a few words about the European context, but it's not only European context. In a way, it's a global one. 3 years ago, the world signed the Paris Agreement, climate agreement, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And the Paris Agreement sets a very specific goal for the world economy, that we should keep the global temperature significantly below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. So very often when I talk to business people or people who are on the job somewhere, and they say, well, I mean, that's nonsense. Either we're not going to do it, or there's no climate change, or we can't do anything about climate change, and so on and so on. So I would like to be much more practical about that. When a target like that is set somewhere, that target is calculated back into hundreds and thousands of regulations and technologies, and these regulations and technologies start impacting our life, our business, and I think also that we have the responsibility to do that. When 10 years ago, it became probably around Copenhagen Conference 2009, which many people suggested that it's a disaster, but it was not a disaster. It was a PR disaster, but it was not a real international diplomacy disaster. Many people were saying, well, whatever is happening, but we can't live without coal. And many governments, many companies continued to invest in coal, continued to invest in gas power stations, and they were thinking, well, these global arrangements, they are some kind of a political thing. Business is business, we continue to do our business. So 10 years later, what happened? Europe has decommissioned about 100 gigawatts of fossil fuel generation capacity earlier than it was expected to. And that was very much because a lot of investors, a lot of companies didn't believe that these conferences and global agreements have anything to do with them. So it's political talk. But it's not. In Europe, at the moment, we can very comfortably say that coal generation is dead. It's dead. Coal is dead. Simple as that. The only problem is that its dead body we have to move out, and the funeral will last 10, 20 years. But it is dead. Nobody is building coal. Nobody wants to invest in coal. In country Turkey introduced feed-in tariff. These are the instruments that countries introduce to support financially renewable energy. Turkey introduced feed-in tariffs for coal. Nobody in Turkey wants to invest in coal. And this is just a little lesson to remind us that these big decisions, they have something to do with our investment policies, investment strategies, and we have to take them seriously. Especially when it comes not to journalistic presentation or just an isolated academic research. It is a global political agreement. The global political agreement on climate change is one thing, The technology advance is a different thing. So during the Copenhagen conference, everybody was speaking about the effort to mitigate climate change in terms of effort and burden and costs. This started with very much with the famous report of Nicholas Stern, who basically introduced sort of the mainstream climate economics. And his notion was, look, it's disaster approaching. In order to avert this disaster, we have to pay. We have to pay probably around 1% of our GDP. If we don't pay 1% of our GDP now, in the future, we will have to pay 5% of GDP. Some assessment even suggests that the damage by climate change could be up to 20% of GDP. 20% of GDP means permanent economic disaster. So that was the notion. Then we all love consultancy companies, and of course the most loved consultancy company around the world is probably McKinsey. McKinsey did a report which was very, very famous. It impacted the policies of every single government, every single company involved in energy generation, in buildings, and so on, and created the so-called cost curve. If you Google, you all have apps apart from me. If you Google cost curve McKinsey, you will say, and McKinsey confirmed, we have to pay now. So guess what? They were all wrong. So it's not about cost, it was investment. And this investment led to decline of the cost of renewable energy, of solar, of wind, but also the introduction of a lot of new technologies and technological solutions, which are already disrupting the energy market, but also a very, very wide area in our business and our economy. So that was quite well understood in China. I mean, I find it very difficult to say that the communist government would understand something better than a democratic one, but they somehow got it. And they realized that investing in new technologies will make them technological leader, and that's what is happening now. We all benefit in a way from that, because the huge investment that China put in renewable energy led to that today renewable energy is cheaper than conventional energy. And I don't want to sound like a Greenpeace activist, but if you look at PPA contracts, these are the long-term contracts for energy. Last year, Siemens won a tender in Turkey for 1 gigawatt of wind for 29 euros per megawatt hour. So 29 euros is kind of at the lower scale of what the European energy markets are offering today, electricity. If we compare this 29 years, then renewable energy is moving towards that mark, around 30 euros per megawatt hour. There are lots of contracts that are lower, but we can question their kind of commercial viability, especially in the Gulf, where there are a lot of kind of free land or pressure on banks to support them and so on. But around 30 euros in today and in the next 5-10 years sounds like a reasonable, good price of the renewable energy. Right as we're speaking, the Bulgarian parliament is debating the restart of a nuclear power plant. A huge mystery for everybody who knows anything about energy, because a nuclear power plant can't produce energy for less than 100 euros. Anybody who is from England and knows the case of Hinkley Point knows that Hinkley Point will sign a contract, if it's finished, for 92 pounds, whatever that is, something like 110 euro per megawatt hour, guaranteed price for 35 years. So that's 3 times more than wind in Turkey can produce. If you want to develop coal power, we all say, well, coal is cheapest. Well, it's not, because European regulations made coal quite expensive. So if you want to build a new coal power plant, you can't build it for less than 8 euro per megawatt hour. If you want to build the most modern and most efficient gas power plant with all cogeneration and everything, all the cycles that make gas fantastically efficient, you can't do it for less than 60 euros, I think. And, I mean, these are rough figures. There are quite a lot of assessments on that. So the thing is that the new technologies are not just entering in order to support our climate goal. They're just cheaper, they matured, and they're there. And these new technologies, energy technologies, are changing everything. And I think they will change also the facility management world. And what is coming now, and I think it would be very good for all of us and you to watch. After the Paris Agreement, there are few things on the European scene that are appearing. So one of them is that the European Council asked the European Commission to prepare a strategy for Europe for 2050, which strategy shows how Europe can move to net zero carbon emission economy by 2050. So many people will dismiss that and will say, oh, nonsense, I mean, Brussels, rubbish. Well, this rubbish killed coal, and this rubbish is killing gas power stations at the moment. Many, dozens of gigawatts, billions and billions of euros are disappearing. So take that seriously. So that means that Europe sounds quite serious that 2050 will be net zero emission. At the same time, there is another document which is being discussed at the moment, is the so-called European budget. It's the multi-year financial framework. It has, like everything European, has a complicated name, which nobody can remember exactly, but it's the 7 years European budget. So it's for a bit more than 1 trillion euros for a 7-year period. Sounds like a huge amount of money, but when you spread it between 27 countries, maybe more than 27, because we pay also for various programs that are outside the European Union, over 7 years, it's not that much. But these are money, this is money that gives directions also. And what the initial proposal for this budget says is that 25% of this budget will go for activities, for investments which are climate related. There is a strong lobby that is pushing this 40% to become this 25% to become 40%. So minimum 25% will go into climate-related investments. The new philosophy of the European budget is that more and more European money should be spent, should leverage private investments. So that would mean that the European Commission, the European government will look for every euro to get another euro, or 2, or 3, or 5, or 15. So there is a so-called EFC, a European Strategic Investment Fund, something like that, famous as the Juncker Fund. So this is a facility that brings some European money and is looking at leveraging and bringing for every euro 15 euros of private investment. It doesn't achieve that target, but it gives you an idea that if we talk about 1 trillion euros, these 1 trillion euros might bring another 5 trillion, might bring another 10 trillion, and certainly will push and give direction for many, many, many other trillions of euros. So basically, they will have a very, very serious impact. And as I said, 25% at least will go into climate-related world. Climate-related projects. So what are the climate-related projects? Climate-related projects is anything that reduces carbon emissions. And this is, for instance, anything to do with buildings, because buildings use 40% of the energy. So how to make our buildings more energy efficient is even now a very outdated question. The question is how to make them how to manage a technological process in buildings which is becoming very, very advanced, because buildings are becoming not just energy consumers, they're becoming energy consumers, they're becoming energy producers. There is this very ugly word, prosumer, that many people like. But even prosumer is an outdated concept. We're talking today about buildings as energy hubs, because buildings consume energy, they generate energy, but they also store energy. They can balance energy, they can trade energy. So each building, especially buildings like this, which has reasonable energy consumption, could become an energy player, an active energy player. And that is happening already. And how exactly that will happen is very much up to us, up to you, because the technological solutions are many. What we can say for sure is that is happening, and that will happen, and it will develop more and more, whether it will develop also through artificial intelligence, blockchain technologies, and all these fancy words which again many people dismiss, saying, well, I mean, these are kind of some kind of technological slang. Our business is hardcore, serious stuff. We will not be affected. Well, we all will be. We have to ask ourselves, for instance, what will happen with the energy distribution companies. Some people say, well, they will die. Some other people say, well, they will not die. So, but it's very difficult to say whether one thing or the other will happen because of all these decentralized and new energy technologies, because of all the IT platforms that are coming and that are changing the way we develop our buildings. And going on a more kind of specific and micro level, to give one or two examples, from next year, the European Union introduces the so-called Near Zero Energy Building Standard. So the Near Zero Energy Building Standard is kind of like many European things. The European Union is very, very determined to have it, but nobody knows what exactly that means. But it basically means that the net energy result of a building should be sort of a zero carbon. It's not exactly zero energy, it's more like zero carbon. That means that all new buildings will have to somehow integrate renewable energy and will have to be very highly efficient. And how will that happen is anybody's guess, because the standard is coming next year. Countries are developing national versions of the standard, but nobody knows how exactly that will work. But what we can say for sure, looking at the examples with the coal power plants, is that it will happen. We don't know how it will happen, but in 1 year it will happen. It will start happening. So it will change the buildings world. And it is affecting only the new buildings, but once the technologies for the new buildings, near zero energy building standards, come, that technologies will start spilling over all the other building retrofits. So this is just one of the many examples, and of course we can look at lots of examples with electric cars, charging stations, electrification of transport. We're discussing now with the Sofia municipality how is it possible to create a strategy for the electrification of public transport. So if I have to finish with the one message is your incredibly important world is will be affected by these global agreements, the European 2050 strategy and the European budget. So look at it and also try to influence it, because Europe and European documents and decisions and solutions are there not only to be followed, but also to be influenced, and they need your influence. So thank you very much.